Everyone tells the same story about the Cybertruck, a wild, radical design decades ahead of its time, a company that dared to be different in an industry that had built the same pickup truck for 100 years, and a public that just wasn't ready for it. It's a flattering story. It turns a failure into a tragedy of vision. The genius who saw too far ahead, punished by a market too conservative to keep up. It is also, almost entirely, wrong. Because 2 years before a single Cybertruck reached a customer's driveway, a team of Tesla's own engineers built an alternative. A pickup that used conventional materials, conventional manufacturing, and a design the entire auto industry already knew how to build at scale. They brought it to Elon Musk, and Musk said no. Not because the radical design was better, not because the numbers said so, because it was his vision and he wanted to build what he wanted to build. Everything that followed, the 18-month head start Ford and Rivian got in the meantime, the base price that nearly doubled from the number promised on stage, the recalls for wheels that could separate from the vehicle at speed, the accelerator pedals that could get stuck under the mat, the panels that fell off the sides of trucks that customers had just driven off the lot. All of it traces back to a single decision, made in a room, by one person, with a safer option sitting right in front of him. This is the true story of how the most hyped vehicle launch in automotive history became one of the most expensive miscalculations in Tesla's and Elon Musk's career. Not because the future arrived too early, because a warning was ignored. It's a story worth telling carefully, because it's easy to tell it wrong in either direction. It would be just as lazy to say the Cybertruck simply flopped because it's ugly, as it is to say it flopped because the world wasn't ready. Both versions let everyone involved off the hook. The real version has a decision, a name attached to that decision, and a chain of consequences that follow directly from it, which is a much less comfortable story and a much more accurate one. To understand how Tesla ended up here, you have to go back to a company that, in 2019, could not lose. Tesla had just crawled out of what insiders called manufacturing hell, the brutal stretch of 2017 and 2018, when the Model 3 nearly bankrupted the company, trying to reach volume production. Production targets were missed quarter after quarter. Musk himself was reportedly sleeping on the factory floor, trying to will the line into working. It was, by every outside account, the closest Tesla had come to collapsing since its earliest days. And then they got through it. The Model 3 became a hit. Not a niche EV curiosity, but a genuine mainstream success. The Model Y was coming next, and it would go on to become one of the best-selling vehicles in North America, full stop, not just among EVs. Tesla controlled the overwhelming majority of the North American EV market. Wall Street had stopped asking whether Tesla would survive and started asking how big it could get. There was no ceiling in sight, and after 2 brutal years, that kind of momentum does something to a team. When you've just come through a war and won, the next impossible goal doesn't feel impossible. It feels inevitable. There was, however, one market Tesla hadn't touched: pickup trucks. And in North America, that market wasn't a niche. It was the single largest and most profitable category in the entire auto industry, worth well over $200 billion a year, and it was dominated by a handful of vehicles whose basic shape, materials, and manufacturing process hadn't meaningfully changed in a century. Ford's F-150 alone had been the best-selling vehicle in America for decades running. To a team riding 2 consecutive wins, a stagnant 100-year-old design wasn't an obstacle. It was an invitation. And to engineers in particular, being handed a blank sheet and told to rethink the pickup truck from first principles is close to the best job in the world. New materials, new manufacturing methods, a chance to throw out a century of convention and start over. so that's what they set out to do. According to later reporting, including Walter Isaacson's biography of Musk, the mandate from the top was explicit: let engineering drive the product. Use materials nobody else was using. Build something that looked like it belonged in a science fiction film, not a dealership lot. Musk reportedly told his team, directly, that he didn't care whether anyone actually bought it. He wanted to build something that pushed the envelope, and he told people not to fight him on the direction. This is also where Musk's particular style of leadership shows up most clearly, a pattern people close to him have described as his "man on Mars" approach. Set a goal so ambitious it borders on absurd. Rally the team around it completely. Even if you fall short, even if you slip the timeline, you've still accomplished something extraordinary just by getting close. It's a genuinely effective way to squeeze maximum effort out of a team. It is also a leadership style, with almost no room in it for a dissenting engineer to say, "This specific piece won't work," because the entire culture is built around treating ambition itself as the point. There's also a specific, deliberate strategy behind announcing a product this early. Tesla had used it before, successfully. Go public with something years before it's ready to ship, and you create mindshare before a competitor even knows to react. You generate hype. You collect real money up front in the form of refundable deposits, which function as a form of free financing while the company builds. It's a genuinely smart playbook, when it works. In November 2019, Tesla staged the reveal. It remains one of the most talked about product launches in automotive history, for a reason nobody planned. During a demonstration, meant to show off the Cybertruck's supposedly unbreakable window glass, a member of the design team threw a steel ball at the door. The glass shattered. Then they tried the window right next to it. It shattered too. Musk looked out at the stunned audience and said one word: "Oops." By any conventional standard, that was a disaster of a demo, live, in front of the world's press. Instead, it became the moment everyone remembered. Nobody had generated this kind of reaction to a vehicle reveal since Steve Jobs first walked on stage with the iPhone. Whether Tesla intended the chaos or not, and the company has always maintained they didn't, it worked better than a scripted success would have. Within 48 hours, roughly 200,000 people had put down deposits on a truck that didn't exist yet, sight unseen beyond a stage prop with broken windows. Within the next couple of years, that number would swell past 1 million reservations worldwide. The design itself split opinion instantly, and it never really stopped splitting it. There was no polite middle ground. People either thought it looked like it drove straight out of Blade Runner, or they thought it looked like an unfinished stage prop that had wandered off a movie set by mistake. In isolation, that kind of polarization isn't necessarily a bad sign. Plenty of successful, iconic products divided opinion early and won people over later. The danger isn't that a product is polarizing, it's what a company does with the people on the inside who are raising real, technical objections, not about how the truck looked, but about whether it could actually be built the way it had just been promised on stage. On that stage, Musk made 3 specific promises that would come to define the next 5 years of this story. The truck would ship in 2021, it would start under $40,000, and it would deliver 500 miles of range on a full charge. Every one of those 3 numbers would eventually break. Here's the part of the story that gets left out. The Cybertruck's design wasn't just polarizing with the public, it was polarizing inside Tesla, among the people who actually had to build it. Journalists and customers split into camps, people who thought it looked like it drove straight out of a science fiction film, and people who thought it looked like an unfinished prop from one. That split is often treated as the whole story. Bold design, love it or hate it, that's just the price of innovation. But a subset of Tesla's own engineers weren't debating aesthetics. They were worried about manufacturability. Stainless steel isn't stamped and shaped the way conventional car body panels are. The entire toolkit the auto industry had spent a century perfecting didn't apply. Flat, unbent stainless panels the size of the Cybertrucks would be exponentially harder to produce at scale, harder to keep consistent, and harder to fix when something inevitably went wrong on the line. So a group inside Tesla reportedly did something bold on its own. They built an alternative. A pickup that kept the spirit of a Tesla truck but used materials and a manufacturing approach the industry already knew how to execute reliably at volume. Something that could realistically hit a 2021 ship date without reinventing how cars are made from the ground up. They brought it to Musk. He said no. They were building his version. The one from the stage. The one with the bulletproof glass that wasn't actually bulletproof. This is the hinge the entire story turns on. Not a bold idea that the market wasn't ready for. A specific, internal, engineering-driven off-ramp, offered and rejected, by the one person in the room whose decision was final. It's worth sitting with why that alternative existed at all. This wasn't a handful of engineers grumbling in a hallway. Building a working, presentable alternative pickup design, even as a skunkworks side project, takes real time, real resources, and real conviction that the primary path is heading somewhere dangerous. Teams don't usually do that for a design quibble. They do it when they believe the thing they're being asked to build is going to blow up the timeline, the budget, or both. The fact that this alternative existed at all is itself evidence that the risk in the stainless steel design wasn't some fringe worry. It was serious enough, inside the building, that people were willing to spend their own time building a working escape hatch. There's a strategic logic to why Tesla announces things so far ahead of shipping them in the first place. It builds mindshare. It captures deposits, which function as free financing. It creates a sense of inevitability before a single unit exists. Tesla had used this playbook before, successfully. But announcing years ahead of delivery has a cost nobody likes to talk about. It tells every competitor exactly what you're planning to build and exactly how long they have to beat you to market. And in this case, the competitors were paying close attention. Rivian, a startup nobody outside the industry had heard of a few years earlier, saw an opening and took it. Ford, sitting on the most valuable nameplate in the entire pickup market with the F-150, saw the same opening from a very different position and had no intention of ceding the electric version of its best-selling product to a newcomer. Rivian's electric pickup, the R1T, reached customers in September 2021, the same year Tesla had originally promised the Cybertruck. Ford's F-150 Lightning followed in the spring of 2022. Both beat Tesla to market by well over a year, with conventional designs that didn't require reinventing a century of manufacturing know-how from scratch. That gap mattered enormously. Early adopters who wanted an electric truck, the moment one became available, didn't wait around. They bought what was actually on a lot. By the time the Cybertruck finally arrived in late 2023, the first electric pickup narrative had already been claimed by someone else, twice. Meanwhile, back at Tesla, engineers were living through a second round of manufacturing hell, this time entirely self-inflicted. Early prototypes were showing the kind of basic defects that shouldn't still exist at the prototype stage. Insufficient structural stiffness, water leaking into the cabin, fundamental fit and finish problems. Not because the team was incompetent, because they were solving problems the rest of the industry had already solved decades earlier, except this time with no playbook to lean on because they'd thrown the playbook out on purpose. Consider what that actually meant in practice. A century of automotive manufacturing had converged on stamped steel body panels. For good reason. The tooling exists at scale, the failure modes are well understood, the supply chain for repairs and replacement parts is mature, and every plant in the world already knows how to work with it. Cold-rolled stainless steel, in the thickness and panel sizes the Cybertruck needed, behaves completely differently. It doesn't stamp into complex curves the way conventional steel does, which is part of why the truck ended up with its flat, faceted look in the first place. That wasn't purely an aesthetic choice, it was a constraint the material imposed. Every process, from cutting to welding to finishing to fixing dents when they inevitably happened, had to be relearned essentially from zero, on a production timeline that had already been publicly promised to 1 million depositors. Even simple things a conventional buyer never thinks about became engineering problems. Body panels this size, in this material, don't hide minor imperfections the way painted steel does. Every ripple, every inconsistency in the surface is visible under the right light, because there's no paint layer to soften it. Getting consistent panel gaps, the seams between adjoining pieces of bodywork, became a genuine struggle on a company that already had a public reputation for uneven panel gaps on its other models. The Cybertruck didn't inherit that reputation by accident. It inherited it and then made the underlying problem materially harder to solve. 2021 came and went. No truck. The Cybertruck finally reached its first customers in late 2023, nearly 2 years past the promised date, 4 years after the reveal. And almost immediately, the gap between the pitch and the product became impossible to ignore. The base price, promised on stage at under $40,000, launched roughly 50% higher in the low 60s for a stripped-down configuration without the features most buyers actually wanted. A properly equipped truck ran into the 80s. Later configurations would push even higher. The top Cyberbeast trim eventually listed above $105,000, a price point too high to even qualify for the federal EV tax credit that had made the original pitch financially realistic for ordinary buyers in the first place. The range fell short too. The 500 miles promised on stage became closer to 320 in the real-world base configuration, a meaningful cut for a vehicle marketed on its capability, not just its looks. And the quality problems started almost immediately. Panel gaps, a category Tesla was already notorious for across its lineup. Windshield wipers, sized for a vehicle this large, that struggled to function properly. Then came the recalls, and they kept coming. Panels detaching from the sides of trucks that customers had only just taken delivery of. Accelerator pedals that could physically dislodge and get stuck under the floor mat, a defect serious enough to raise real safety concerns in a nearly 6,000-pound vehicle. A drive inverter fault that could cause a sudden, total loss of propulsion mid-drive. Rear-view camera failures that could impair visibility at the exact moment a driver needed it most. And, years into production, a defect where cracks could form around the brake rotor's stud holes, severe enough that the wheel itself could eventually separate from the vehicle while in motion. By the time that wheel separation recall was issued, in 2026, it was Tesla's own admission that on rough roads or hard cornering, the stress on those studs could cause them to crack and, eventually, let a wheel come off entirely. A defect regulators explicitly flagged as raising the risk of a crash. The company replaced hubs, lug nuts, and brake rotors on every affected vehicle at no cost. There's a specific kind of irony in that recall covering only 173 trucks, not because the fix was small, but because so few of that particular configuration had sold in the first place. Tesla had actually already discontinued that lower-cost, steel-wheeled rear-wheel drive version months earlier, citing limited demand. meaning the recall arrived for a variant of the truck the company had already quietly given up trying to sell. Even the process of investigating some of these defects ran into trouble. In at least one case, Tesla's own engineers reportedly couldn't gather enough information to fully understand a component failure, because too few owners responded to outreach. A strange problem to have, until you remember just how small the total ownership base actually was. A recall program depends on a large enough population of real-world vehicles generating enough data to spot patterns quickly. When a vehicle badly underperforms its sales targets, even its recalls move slower. That's the pattern worth sitting with. The Cybertruck wasn't failing because a handful of customers ran into isolated bad luck. It was failing structurally, repeatedly, in ways that outside observers had begun openly counting. By the truck's second full year on the road, it had already accumulated more recalls than most vehicles see across their entire production run. Researchers went looking for why. When they surveyed people who had shown early interest in the Cybertruck, but ultimately didn't buy one, the reasons stacked up in a clear order. Price came first, reliability and safety concerns came second, the gap between the promised specs and the delivered product came third. And underneath all of it sat a fourth, quieter problem: utility. A pickup truck buyer isn't usually buying a truck for what they do with it every single day. They're buying the readiness to do anything with it, whenever a need shows up. Tow a boat, help a friend move, haul something heavy on short notice. That readiness is baked into the traditional truck shape for practical reasons that go back decades. A bed that's easy to load over a low tailgate, a shape that doesn't punish you for scraping it on a job site, a design language that doesn't broadcast your net worth to everyone on the highway. Drive a well-worn Ford F-150 or Toyota Tundra, and a stranger has no easy way to know whether it costs $35,000 or $75,000. The Cybertruck's angular, unmistakable shape does the opposite. It advertises itself, and by extension, advertises exactly how much you spent on it. The Cybertruck's shape and bed design made that kind of everyday flexibility harder to deliver on than a conventional truck, and its unmistakable silhouette made it a far more conspicuous purchase than the vehicles it was supposed to be competing with, which meant that even buyers who loved the look struggled to justify the price against what the vehicle could actually, practically do for them, and how it made them look doing it. Then, in the fall of 2024, an entirely different kind of problem arrived. Musk's public, high-profile entry into that year's presidential campaign didn't just make headlines. It attached the entire Tesla brand to one side of American politics, whether individual buyers wanted that association or not. Surveys taken afterward found a majority of respondents said the political association was now actively steering them away from buying a Tesla at all, because in an era where a parked car in your driveway reads as a public statement, nobody wants that statement chosen for them by a headline. Every brand challenge Tesla was already carrying landed hardest on the vehicle that had the least room to absorb it. Tesla's other models, the Model 3, Model Y, Model S, had years of established reputation, existing owners, and a broad base of buyers who'd made their purchase decision long before politics entered the picture. The Cybertruck had none of that cushion. It was brand new, still trying to win over skeptical buyers on price and reliability alone, and now it carried a political headline attached to the name on the tailgate at the exact moment it needed goodwill the most. For a vehicle that already stood out on the road more than almost anything else in its class, that visibility became a liability instead of an asset. Owning one stopped being a statement about liking the future. For a meaningful share of the public, it became a statement about something else entirely, whether the owner intended that or not. The sales numbers tell the rest cleanly. Musk had projected 250,000 Cybertrucks sold every year, Total units sold since the 2023 launch never came close. Independent estimates put the real cumulative figure at no more than roughly 65,000 trucks across more than 2 years on the market, with year-over-year sales actually falling by nearly half heading into 2026. Quarterly sales that once might have sounded respectable in isolation looked considerably worse next to the competition. Both GM's Hummer EV and Ford's electric F-150 were outselling the Cybertruck in some quarters by more than 50%, despite entering the market with none of the Cybertruck's cultural momentum or head start in hype. And then there's the detail that undercuts even the modest numbers Tesla did report. Registration data later showed that Musk's own company, SpaceX, had become one of the largest single buyers of Cybertrucks, accounting for close to 1 in 5 of every unit sold in the US in a single quarter. Even with that internal demand propping the number up, registrations kept sliding. The company selling the truck was, in effect, quietly buying its own inventory to soften how bad the real consumer number looked, and it still wasn't enough to hide the decline. By 2026, Tesla had reportedly built up roughly $200 million in unsold Cybertruck inventory sitting on lots and in storage. Production had to be pulled back to match the demand that actually existed rather than the demand that had been projected on a stage 7 years earlier. And the recalls hadn't stopped. By the time the wheel stud issue surfaced, outside trackers had already counted the Cybertruck, racking up more separate recall campaigns in its first 2 years on the road than most vehicles see across their entire production lifespan, covering everything from the accelerator pedal to the rear-view camera to a faulty hood latch. Each one, on its own, might have been a manageable story. Stacked together, on a vehicle already fighting an uphill battle on price and reputation, they became the story. So, what actually killed the Cybertruck? Not a public that couldn't handle the future. Not a design too bold for its time. The public, if anything, showed up in force. 1 million deposits is not the behavior of a market that rejects an idea. The real failure sits earlier than the launch, earlier than the recalls, earlier than the price hikes. It sits in a room, sometime before 2021, where a group of Tesla's own engineers laid out a version of this truck that could realistically ship on time at the promised price without reinventing a century of automotive manufacturing from zero. Where the person with the final say chose the harder, riskier, more expensive path instead, not because the data supported it, but because it was his. Every downstream problem is just that decision, compounding. The 18-month head start handed to Ford and Rivian by announcing too early and then taking too long to deliver. The price that crept toward double the original promise, because manufacturing a design nobody in the industry had ever built at scale, turned out to be exactly as expensive as the engineers had warned. The recalls, because a radical, unproven design produced radical, unproven failure points. Wheels, pedals, panels, inverters, one after another, for years. Even the political liability, once it landed, hit hardest on the one vehicle in Tesla's lineup that had no buffer of trust left to absorb it. None of this required a market that wasn't ready. It required one avoidable choice, made against internal advice, at the exact moment the company had the option to choose differently. And it's worth being precise about what this story is not. It's not a story about electric trucks failing as a category. Ford's and GM's electric pickups, whatever their own struggles, didn't require reinventing the manufacturing process from zero, and both ended up outselling the Cybertruck despite starting with a fraction of its hype. It's not a story about the public rejecting bold design outright. 1 million people put down deposits on a vehicle they'd only seen on a stage with broken glass, which is about as strong a signal of appetite for something different as a market can send. And it's not really a story about bad luck either. Wheels don't crack at the stud holes by accident, and accelerator pedals don't work loose from years of unlucky coincidence. Those are engineering outcomes, and engineering outcomes trace back to engineering decisions. The Cybertruck wasn't ahead of its time, it was behind on its own promises, from the very beginning, and the people who could have prevented that were in the room and were overruled. There's a version of this story where the ending is different, where the internal alternative gets built instead, ships close to on time, launches near the original price, and Tesla claims the first electric pickup title that instead went to Rivian and Ford. It probably wouldn't have gone viral the way a shattered, unbreakable window did. It probably wouldn't have generated 1 million deposits from people who'd never seen the thing in person. But it also wouldn't have needed 6+ recalls to become roadworthy, wouldn't have doubled its promised price before a single unit shipped, and wouldn't still be sitting hundreds of millions of dollars of unsold inventory deep on lots across the country years after its debut. That's the trade a company makes when it chooses vision over the version its own engineers are quietly begging it to build. Sometimes that bet pays off spectacularly. This time, the truck it built matched the one on stage almost exactly, right down to the parts that were never supposed to break. That's the true origin of the Cybertruck's collapse.